All right, so good morning and welcome to the webinar, Transcending Gender, Working with Intersectional, Transgender, and LGBTI Populations, presented by Orion Block. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us. Before we get started, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items. This webinar is produced by the Underserved Populations Training Project, a project of the Center for Innovation and Resources. Funding for this project comes from the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, Victim Services Branch, with funding made possible through the United States Department of Justice Victims of Crime Act. For those of you who can hear me, this might seem obvious, but I just want to remind everyone to turn on their speakers in order to hear the presentation. The chat panel is where you can ask us questions. We'll answer the tech questions immediately in the chat panel. If you don't see your question right away, we are keeping track and we'll save them for Q&A time at the end. When sending a chat, please choose all participants from the drop-down menu so that everyone can see your question. And now a little bit about our presenter. Orion Block, pronoun Z, here and hers, has been participating in LGBTQIA activism for over 12 years. Her activism includes organizing Pride celebrations, volunteering at the Los Angeles LGBT Center in the Law Department and as a meeting facilitator, working with LGBTQ homeless youth, and organizing and participating in panels. Orion attended CSU Northridge, receiving her bachelor's in Gender and Women's Studies with a minor in Queer Studies. She graduated with a master's in social work and is published in Ophelia Scholarly Journal. Currently, Orion is a licensed social worker working towards her clinical license at Nevada Behavioral Solutions and is the team lead for Trans Lifeline Crisis Support. Now, please bear with me for a moment and I'll transfer the controls over to Orion.
Hi, everybody. Before I get started, I'm a very casual presenter and I really encourage questions throughout. I'm going to be talking about stuff that is going to probably be challenging some of you out there. And so if you do have questions, please type them in the chat box and someone will let me know that you're typing in the chat box and then I'll stop and answer questions. After each section, I will ask though. And so let's get started. Breaking by. When I first started doing this presentation, people would normally think I was talking about bisexuality, but really going to be talking about gender for most of this. And the reason is because all of our LGBTQIA alphabet soup really does hinge on our gender norms. Okay, so first off, we're going to go over the gender unicorn. Some of you may have seen this before. This is a really cool graphic by Trans Student Educational Resource, and you can get this online. So when we're looking at some of these gender identities, we're looking at kind of like nothing to female, like there's a continuum. So it's not like male on one side, female on the other. When we look at gender, we're looking at how we portray ourselves, what we feel inside, you know, what goes on through our minds. When we're looking at gender expression, that's kind of like how we're dressing, like what we're showing people. For instance, wearing a wedding dress when we're getting married signifies, you know, that we're a bride and we're a woman and that we're getting dressed up and that we're virginous or whatever. The sex that we were assigned at birth. We have male, female, and other. And this is the one thing that I don't really care for in this gender unicorn, because as you can see, right in the crotch area, there is this double helix indicating like XXXY. Unfortunately, what a lot of people don't know is that we actually have 16 recognized sex chromosomal makeups from X, Y, 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 and XXY, and a lot of other ones. So when we're looking at this, this is like, so for instance, when we hear that someone's pregnant, the first thing that we ask is it a boy or a girl, right? Well, actually, boy and girl is gender, not sex, male and female. And how we actually tell whether we have a boy or a girl is the doctor looks between the baby's legs and says, oh, is it a penis or a vagina or something else? Now, the something else, of course, historically and even currently, some places is getting fixed, air quotes fixed, because it may not need to be fixed. It may just be kind of our spectrum of gender and spectrum of sex presentation. Again, with the chromosomes, we can have XY, which would denote like a male, but that doesn't mean that the testosterone is going to start during puberty when a male would start getting, like gonads and we've all seen adolescent boys. We've all smelled them too. So, there is no indicator that is necessarily that boy is going to actually get that testosterone. I'm going to briefly go over sexually attracted to and emotionally attracted to. So sometimes we are, sexually attracted to women or men or other because there are other genders. And I'm going to go under the assumption for this whole presentation that there are more than just two genders. And well, I am one of them. My identify as agender. And I will go into some of the genders a little bit later and with other people's questions. Are romantically attracted to. We can be romantically attracted to, but not sexually attracted to people. Many people that are asexual, so who have no desire to have sex with people, can be romantically or emotionally attracted to people, but never actually want to have a sexual relationship with them. And that's totally okay. And I think that many times with our friends, we have kind of this like romance or, like our friend that we have strong feelings about, but not necessarily that we want to like have intimate contact with. All right. Is there any questions on that?
We don't have any questions yet.
Okay, I'll move on then. Perfect. All right, so we're going to talk about gender. So I did already talk about the sex assignment pre-birth, how we say, is it a boy or a girl? And we have like the reveal cake and the reveal balloons and this kind of stuff. But really that is putting on like what we have gone to the doctor and then looked through and seen that there's like a little penis or there's not a little penis, because that's really how they show. When they give you your ultrasounds, they do put XX or XY on there, but that's inaccurate because they actually don't test for chromosomes at all, unless there's something wrong. And sometimes when there is certain testing for certain things, or there are some prenatal tests that do test chromosomes, but most people don't get those. So what we're really looking at is like, is there a penis or is there not a penis? So when we're looking at genitalia that we're not sure exactly what it was, we have historically medically conformed. Mostly that was, oh, well, it doesn't quite look like a big enough penis, so we're going to turn it into a vagina. And that has been really hard for a lot of intersex people or people that are not female, because their hormones start kicking in at some point. And so that's when a lot of things happen. That's when there's a lot of problems and a lot of confusion and a lot of damage that's done because the parents were trying to fix something that really didn't need to be fixed. There was just a abnormality, but also like nature loves varieties. So, everybody's not the same. We don't have a lot of education, especially in the medical fields, and I've done presentations for Kaiser and some other hospitals, and it is astounding how little that they know about actual chromosomal makeups and actually other than like, oh, it's a penis or a vagina. So I'm going to look at some forms. when we're looking at forms, and this is an actual medical form from a hospital for a study, they have gender as male and female, except that's really not gender. Gender is man, woman, transgender, male to female, female to male, gender fluid, agender, bigender, demi boy, demi girl. Those are genders. So we're talking about like what people label themselves, like is it a blue blanket or pink blanket? This would be more accurate if they said sex and male, female, but they really should have intersex here. But again, as I said, there really aren't just two sexes. That's just like what we go by. If anything really is coming up for you though, this can be very, very triggering for people because sometimes our foundations of what we know, this is challenging that. All right, so how do we keep our gender as two genders? How do we keep sex and gender? In fact, earlier this year, you know, there was talk about making a federal documentation where male equaled man and female equaled woman. So there is a tie-in to our government. Our Census Bureau, really interesting if you're looking historically through our Census Bureau, there really was only black and white. People were Caucasian or they were black, and then you saw Hispanic, and then Hispanic went away for a minute, and then you started seeing Asian cultures. When we look at Census Bureau, it only encompasses what the government deems real, and right now they don't deem anything other than male and female real, and they don't ask about gender. They just ask about male or female. They do ask all this other demographic information and ethnicity, which is great. There has been some movement by trans people to actually have trans identities and have gender on there, but so far there's been no change. But again, the census historically has evolved. Our documentation, now this is a new thing, some of the states are actually having an X on their documentation, and we call them gender markers, which is a misnomer. They're sex markers, so we have F, M, or X in some states. So California does, Nevada just does, and I think that there's 5 or 6 other states that have this too. So there's something changing. We're realizing that like this does not, our driver's license, our passports don't necessarily encompass. There is movement, but still like this is slow moving where there's a lot of people that have identified not as a male or female, not as a man or a woman, but we just haven't really looked into that. Now, you might be questioning, well, I thought this was an LGBTQIA. Yes, when we're looking at how we view people, a lot of the gay people, lesbian, gay men, bisexual people will face transphobia because people are like, what are you trying to be a guy? What are you trying to be a girl? Something to that effect, because of how they present. And that's their gender presentation. So we're talking about, butch, quote, butch looking women, effeminate looking men, men that are wearing, and usually it's a little bit more about men wearing women's clothing, wearing makeup, where that's a real problem. But women don't get as much flack for it, although there's still a treatment where, little girls, when you ask them, oh, well, girls have long hair and boys have short hair, and little boys will say that too. And we have, even if you, with people that have raised their kids as gender neutral, as soon as they go to school, they're seeing like Disney princesses, they're seeing everything in society that says this is a boy, this is a girl, and why we keep these this way. And this is our society, like our policing of our own society, but this is also backed up by our laws. So I'm sure many of you have heard of these, the bathroom bills that have happened where they say that the bathroom that you use needs to represent who you, where you go to the bathroom, and a lot of it is fear of men in the women's bathroom, but there has been no incidences of trans women, what some people would call men, trans women, so women with a penis, attacking and sexually assaulting a cisgender, so a non-transgender woman in a bathroom. But trans women have regularly been assaulted verbally and physically in bathrooms, and actually trans masculine or trans men, so people who were assigned female at birth and identify as male or not a woman, not female, have been attacked in bathrooms also. So again, our laws are definitely favoring the majority. Um, Another thing about the bathrooms, I I was just actually just looking at these boy and girl, and I just noticed that like the boy is just like a person, and then the girl is like has a skirt on, and I don't know a lot of women that wear skirts all the times. So yeah, anyway, there has been some move for gender neutral bathrooms if there's like, single use restrooms, but a lot of countries don't actually have separation of men and women bathrooms. They just kind of, it's a bathroom, it's a toilet, go do what you need to do. All right, social conforming. So I did talk about this a little bit. Again, when we are looking at young children and we're looking at kids that are not doing the right things, not playing with the right toys, not wearing the right things, the little boy that wants to wear a headband or the little girl that really refuses to wear a dress. We have expectations of children. We have expectations that they are going to be a certain way, act a certain way, do something, even to the point of up and getting married, having children, things like that, where that's not really allowing those children to be autonomous. Not the kids should just be allowed to run free without any kind of rules, but considering that they actually are autonomous human beings. So this little thing here. This was actually an old cutout from the 50s of a paper doll. And this was like a genderless paper doll. This was a baby, because babies are essentially, unless you actually look between their legs, they're the same. Babies are babies. They just loll their heads around, they blow weird bubbles out of their nose with snot, and they make oogie googie noises for the most part. And these outfits are also very gender neutral for the time. When we actually think about gender of how it is today, you go into any, gosh, it doesn't even work like that anymore, but go into Target, go into any department store, you have the men's section and the women's section, the girls section and the boys section. I'm not really seeing a gender neutral section, but there's a lot of people that do shop in other sections, right? But we still have, when we look at some of the gender expectations and the clothing, men's clothing are made a lot more sturdy. They're made for long-term use, and they're made a little bit cheaper, less expensive, but not cheaper materials, where women's clothing is made lighter, more flimsy, more disposable, like it's not going to last a long time, and their cost is actually higher. So we do have a little bit of a discrepancy on men's and women's clothing. And a lot of that is definitely marketing. But we also, if you look at especially the boys and the girls sections, there's a lot more pink and purple in the girls section and a lot more blue and gray in the boys section. You might be saying, oh, like, duh, we know this. Yes, but that's a problem when you have flimsier clothes on girls that are rough and tumble just as much as the boys, or boys that really like that pink shirt, but there's none in that color. And I think everybody likes a teddy bear. So, the idea that there's like a softer or like a sugar and spice sex and a snakes and snails and puppy dog tails is definitely social targeted on people. Again, gendered marketing. Um, some of you may have known that the colors for boys and girls were actually opposite, pink being for boys and blue being for girls. And it was because pink was seen as like a robust, lively color, and blue was seen as like a serene, calm color. And this was changed in the late 30s, early 40s, when there was some communist targeting, especially to like the communist parties in Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, and Russia. And there was this idea that, well, we want, their flag is red, we're going to make, you know, this pink. And this is off of an article and some research that I've done, but the pink was a lighter color of red. And so it was saying, oh, well, you are like a sissy. And again, like making anything that feminine, anything pink, anything soft was less than, was like not to be appreciated, like seen as actually bad, terrible. And even with when we have like teasing, like what do we use, like bitch, um, sissy, oh, are you crying like a girl, or you throw like a girl, and it's making women, females, like the lesser gender, the lesser sex, the idea that there's a lesser than. So we're going to look at this. This is just kind of like promoting on like when gender actually started to being constructed in, and it is part of capitalism. It's part of like how we understand who we are as people. This was a really fun, I don't know, this was an advertised, sent out, I think $1,000 for the winner of the person that could identify what gender each of these children were. Now, it didn't have boy and girl written on there. They ended up giving a prize to someone that got all but one, but no one was able to actually identify all of them, because boys and girls, until they hit puberty, pretty much are the same. Like until those hormones hit, they look the same. Facially, we can't tell if someone's a boy or a girl. I know that we like to make sure everybody knows that we have a boy or a girl when we're pushing them around in the cart and they're saying how cute your little girl is. Oh, wait, is it a boy? That type of a thing. But we really have to consider, and this is just challenging kind of the norm. If we can't guess these, if no one can guess which one is a boy and which one is a girl by these pictures, and I would say pictures even today with babies, especially if we don't have them dressed in boys, quote, boys or girls clothes, like what are we doing putting them in pink or blue? Why is it important that strangers know what genitals that these babies have? So that's just something to consider, that when we are dressing them in these clothes or that clothes, it is trying to flag and say, hey, these are the genitals that this child has. Which, when you put it that way, it is very kind of off-putting and strange, right? All right, so let's look at the history of people that are gender nonconforming. Now, when I talk about this, and I know that there's an LGBTQ, so when we talk about gender and gender performance and what people look like and how people are supposed to act and be, there have been, and I was able to find pictures and stories up to the 1400s in Europe. But then there also have been discoveries of graves where it was supposed to be a female grave, like a female burial, buried one way, but they found that it was like a male skeletal structure. So there is something where like this has been going on for a long time. This isn't like a new thing. So when we're looking at this, Queen Christina actually kind of went around for a long time as a man and decided that she didn't really want to be queen, and lived as a man, had several woman lovers. So Belva Lockwood was the first woman to run for president. Of course, did not win. That would have been historic, before women could vote. So women have only had the vote since 1910. I believe that she ran in 1840, I believe. A lot of people assigned female at birth will dress as they need to get work done. Sometimes that's a safety thing. let's not get raped. They found many, many soldiers from the Civil War that were not known to be female until they died, and then, of course, upon finding their bodies, that they discovered that they were females. Angelique Berlin was actually one of these soldiers, not in France. She dressed as a man. She went through her whole career as a guy, and then it was found out at some point that she was a woman, but she was still promoted to an officer position because she did such a good job. And so she was a woman officer in the French military. Billy Tipton is a newer one. He really was into music, wanted to play. Women were not allowed to play in jazz clubs and in most like bar type settings. So he dressed in a suit. He played several instruments. Piano was his main instrument, and he was known as a womanizer and dated many women, and ended up passing away in the early 90s. And his kids, everyone around him believed that he was a man, and he was a man for all intents and purposes, but it was found out when he died that he was female. He was assigned female at birth. He was female bodied, and but that was hidden for years and years and years, and the only person that knew was his wife. But he was a womanizer. And we're talking about people assigned male at birth. And again, we're looking at a binary male and female, right? So many people assigned male at birth, again, theater and arts, gymnasts, and political advisors. Let's talk about gymnasts for a second. Many circuses, many physical feats when they didn't necessarily want to bring women around, and women not for years and years and years, centuries even, were not encouraged to be physically active. So they would many times have men dress in a woman costume and then do gymnastics, the trapeze in that garb, as a woman. But that doesn't mean that they identified as women. So when we're looking at this, and there's a lot of like, we don't know, because transgender is a new word, like lesbian's a new word, gay is kind of a newer word. And so we don't know how these people identified, not really, unless there's, written texts from them about how they identified. So again, we don't know if they're transgender, we don't know if they're gay, we don't know if they're lesbian. It's all unknown, but there is this like consistent, persistent, like where they were dressed as in their careers, they were dressed throughout their lives, they did their work this way. So Mademoiselle Chelvier was, this is her down at the bottom, having a sword fight. She would regularly dress in women's clothing, or he would regularly dress in women's clothing. He was a spy, and he was a political advisor to the king, and he would challenge anyone in a dress. But it was very interesting that he was able to navigate through political fields and still like remain true to herself or himself or their self. Barbette was quite a well-known vaudeville performance artist and was quite sought after. Her story is a little interesting one. And this is why I'll say this, he would do a whole concert, and a lot of this takes place like the vaudeville era, but do a whole concert with his violin, and at the very end, he'd whip off his wig and throw it at the audience, which I find extremely endearing. But, there's always been like kind of a little bit of a gender bending. So, but these are all different types of people. These are, and of course, I'm very cognizant that these are white presenting, they're Eurocentric, and I am going to move on to things. So when we're talking about binary, we're looking at historical things, and historically, we haven't always needed to cling to this men and women, male and female, even though we feel like it has. A lot of when we started to colonize from Europe, I'm going to say we because many of us are coming from them, um, colonizing from Europe, going into other countries, there was this firm structure needed to control the natives, to control the indigenous populations, usually done by force. Oh, we're going to cut off your arm. So men need to go work and do this. Women need to go have babies and take care of this. And if you don't abide by that, he will kill you or make it very, very hard for you to live. Many cultures, indigenous cultures, did have kind of a more of a flow of people. And my idea on that is that when we have tribal communities, each person is extremely important to keep everyone else alive. So when we're talking about smaller communities, we're going to find jobs for everybody. So colonization really enforces the binary of you're a man, you're a woman, you have this part, you're this, you have this part, you're this, and a way to control people. And we can see that, you know, through crusades up to present. So we're going to look at some non-Eurocentric, India Hijras, indigenous Two-Spirit. Two-Spirit was because the indigenous population of the US was so fractured after kids were taken away, tribes, indigenous American Indian tribes were moved around. There was kind of a consensus by all of them that they did have people who identified as both male and female, or neither male and female, or everything, or nothing. Cherokee has 5 genders. And so Two-Spirit kind of encompassed anyone who identified within the spectrum of gay, bisexual, transgender, what we would count that, and intersex. And we do have like some pictures. I'm just going to, so this is our hijras. And so hijras have been a big part of the culture in India, invited to baby showers and weddings as good luck. But also after colonization of India, became kind of pariah. So people still will invite them to weddings and baby showers as good luck, but then also they are tortured and killed because they're seen as something bad, mostly brought on by like a European sentiment. Here are some pictures of our Two-Spirit folks. I don't know what tribe this is from, but I was really, really excited to find these pictures. And of course, gosh, they must have sat for forever for these pictures. But you know, our indigenous Two-Spirit folks, we have a lot of islander cultures. Again, every person being really of importance. So no matter how they how they identified or what they saw themselves as, they were brought into the fold. And with many of these cultures, they were seen as the hijras, they were seen as spiritual people, as closer to God, as mediators, as counselors, as shaman. So kind of held in a special kind of revered point. And this, I think, also went against a lot of, when we're talking about crusades, when we're talking about colonization, we're also talking about a lot of Christianity and a lot of missions, which was very good for a lot of people, but there's also been a lot of damage done in the name of God. And I think that historically that has happened. And I'm not, you know, not just for one God, but we have a history on this earth of, well, you don't believe like me, we're going to kill you. So if these people who are Two-Spirit, if these people who are hijras are seen as like shaman, or seen as like pagan, then trying to change them and can make them conform is going to be a way to kind of impress upon with your colonization, right? To control. All right. So I know it's LGBTQI, but let's talk about the transgender stuff because maybe you already know about the LGBT. We have a really difficult population. Transgender people, particularly transgender women of color, many undocumented, have a very hard time in this country and all over the world. But in this country, undocumented trans women of color. Before I go on, are there any questions that we need to touch on, Emma?
We did have a few questions. So if you could give a bit more clarification on the difference between sex and gender.
Right. Okay. So sex is the doctor looks between the baby's legs and says, oh, there's a penis. Oh, there's a vagina. So you're a male or female. And we get stamped on our birth certificate, male or female. If there is a not an understood or like ambiguous genitalia, many times that will be labeled as intersex or X. Many times historically that has been changed, like surgically changed, which has been problematic for people getting as they grow up. Gender is how we identify ourselves, like in our souls. Not necessarily what our genitalia links to, but like, are we a girl? Are we a boy? Are we a man? Are we a woman? And we have all these kind of ideas in society what a man and a woman is. But then also when we look at that, there's all kinds of women and there's all kinds of men. There's women bodybuilders that have very little breast tissue, and there's men that have breasts. There are all kinds of body types, and we can't say that like a woman is only this tall and only has this broad of shoulders. We can't say that a man is only supposed to be this short. He can't be any shorter than this and only have this type of facial. There's lots of women. We have had historical, and every person, let's be honest about like body hair and facial hair. Every person has facial hair. It's just the women in society work really, really hard to get rid of that facial hair. Gender is how we portray ourselves, like how we wear, like even buttons on our clothing. They button one side for men and the other side for women. I'm not really sure who decided that, but that's, if we look at clothing and how we present and how we want other people to treat us. But again, we can still identify as women if we are women with short hair, and still identify as men if we are men with long hair and wear skirts. But it is more about who you as a person inside you connect as. Now, if you're me, nothing works for you, and so I'm a gender, and that means I have a no identified gender, and I'm actually really comfortable with that at this point. It took me a long time to get there. Did that clarify?
Perfect. And the second question was a definition of agender, which you just brought up. So perfect.
Okay. Yay. Okay. Yeah. Please ask questions, because I'm used to doing this in front of people. So I see the question marks in their eyes, and I kind of like will stop and say, hey, what's going on? So yeah, if you have questions, please ask, because I can't tell what's going on with you all. All right. I'll get back to this. Any other questions?
We did have one more. What the definition of demi-male and demi-female?
Okay, so that one's a fun one. That's something where I would say actually look it up online, because demi-male, demi-female, demi-boy, demi-girl, there are all these new terms that are coming out these days, and people are self-identifying. Demi-male and demi-female, I haven't necessarily heard of, but I've heard of demi-boy and demi-girl, which demi-boy would be like somewhat demi, boy, and somewhat girl. But again, that is to each person, it's their own definition. And because I'm just one trans person in the spectrum of trans people, I can only speak from my personal experience or what people that I work with have told me, and from research that I've done. So I will have to say that I can't specifically identify that question, but there is a lot of information online. But when we're talking about demi-female, demi-male, that I'm not as familiar with those terms, but I do understand like the demi idea. Did that answer the question? Kind of.
Great. And we did have one last one.
Okay.
If you know of where they could get information about the 16 chromosomal configurations.
Okay, I'm gonna have to dig back through that, and you're gonna have this up on the on your website for a while, right?
Yes.
I'm gonna have to go back through my research and pull out my chart for that. But I can definitely give it to you all. Will you be able to put that up, Emma?
I will definitely put that up. And that
Okay.
was all the questions for now.
Okay. All right, so let's get right into the kind of meat and potatoes and the awfulness. All right, so a few years ago, there was a survey that went out, but this data has been known. This is the data that has been gathered, but when gathering data from underrepresented communities, many who are homeless, who don't have stable housing, who do not feel like they can identify as their gender, or dress as their gender out of fear of death or being hurt or losing their housing. Sometimes statistics aren't as freely open as we would like them. So we always think that there's probably, whenever we're doing like homeless population, when we're looking at homeless populations, like whatever data is recorded, we think it's actually like a little bit more. So for instance, can't change their gender on their IDs. This is probably not as accurate now, but for a few years ago it was. There is a lot more ability to change gender, especially in California. Very cool right now. Nevada, where I'm at, we just got an X on that driver's license, so it's a little bit easier. But a lot of states do not recognize and will not change birth certificates. 57% rejected by families. I would say that this is probably higher. When we're talking rejected by families, we're talking like anything from they've been killed by their parents to parents that are kind of tolerating but not really understanding or wanting to understand. Rejection for trans people and really for LGBT people is huge in how they feel about themselves, if they're going to be successful in work, and in life in general. If they have support from family, they do much better. And so when we're talking about trans kids, when we're talking about young queer children, like a parent cannot necessarily understand or agree with, but trying to still show love to their child is super important. And so I would like to encourage you, if you're working with people, if you're like in a social work type setting, if you're in medical, like trying to bridge a gap between the parents and the children, and even adult children too, because there are many children that have come out to their parents and all of a sudden they don't have anywhere to stay, and they end up on the street doing survival sex work. Right. 19% experience homelessness. I believe that that's higher. There's a lot of couch surfing within the LGBT community. So they're being rejected by families and then being homeless, of course, go hand in hand. Refuse medical care. This is actually with some of my research and some of the folks that I've worked with and from my own experiences, medical care is is troubling. When you go, let's say someone is going to get a pelvic exam, they have been assigned female at birth, and even there's an assumption that you are either having sex or not having sex with a man who has a penis, and the protection and birth control and everything that goes with that. So even questions now for regular female exams are very problematic. When we're talking about trans people, so trans men that have a vagina, not getting care is real. And there's, uh, just a couple of days ago, an article came out about a trans man that was pregnant and ended up having a miscarriage because he wasn't taken seriously in the hospital, and the doctors just thought he was obese. So that's new news. So healthcare is really, really difficult. And if you're thinking like emergency services, when going into emergency services, it's scary anyway. Like nobody really wants to go in the emergency room. But having to try to like educate about your gender, and you maybe being the first person that's transgender, I would say that gay and lesbian is not as big of a deal. However, we still have issues with people thinking that men that sleep with men or gay men automatically have HIV or AIDS. The attempting suicide, it's really high, and that has to do with all these other things that are going on. If you are not accepted by society, then the 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 idea of depression, mental health for LGBT communities, mental health is really, really poor. And then people knowing how to actually interact with folks that are LGBT, and I would say particularly people that are transgender, because um, people they don't want to touch it. They think, oh, because you've been in the DSM, that of course you're going to have these problems. All right, so I'm just going to go over this very kind of briefly. Really sad stuff. These pictures aren't necessarily the current, but as of 2018, 25 trans women in the US that we know of were killed. There is still in use the gay panic defense or the trans panic defense, where people, if they find out that someone's transgender, then they go into a rage and they kill them. Many times, many of these people are killed by their intimate partners or by the Johns. There many women are doing sex work because getting real work, getting legit work is hard for someone who may not pass. And I'm doing a lot of air quotes. There are certain terms that are harmful and hurtful, and passing is something that passing as a cisgender woman is very, very important, or a cisgender man is very important to many trans people, because it's a safety thing. I'm not going to read this to you because you can read this, but I just want you to keep in mind that many times there are people that it just seems like everywhere they go, they keep getting rejected, and they're doing the best that they can, just being who they are. So sometimes, trans people, especially trans women of color, have had a hard go of it. And being undocumented on top of that is very, very difficult. And there's not a lot around for people. So I just want you to keep this in mind, that there is a very serious epidemic, and I would say almost like femicide, of trans women of color consistently being killed just for being them. All right, so here's the fun part. So we're going to talk about transgender stuff, because being gay and lesbian, bisexual, many times we kind of understand that at this point in the game. Transgender is not understood as much, and so there are some terms that we should not use. Okay. These terms I'm not going to even say. I will say drag queen. Many times people are mistaken for a drag queen. The difference between someone who's transgender and someone who's a drag queen is money. People who do drag are doing it for money. It is a show, a performance. The first word here, this is what many people hear before they die. Trans people regularly get called this. There are some trans people that choose to use that to identify themselves, and that's okay. It is not a widely accepted term. Hermaphrodite, this is an old term, and what hermaphrodite would be intersex at this point. So someone who has genitalia or ambiguous genitalia or genitalia of both males and females. He, she, let's just not. Right, here's some, and she-male. Ladyboy is, some people do identify themselves as it. I haven't heard many. Ladyboy is used in Thailand almost exclusively, but it is closely linked to the sex trade. And okay, so transgender, not transgendered. You don't become transgender, like you don't get transgendered. Also transgender is transgender people, or transgender. Here's what we can use. Transgender person or people. Trans man, trans woman, trans as like kind of an umbrella overarching. Queer, if appropriate. Queer is a difficult term for some older generations because many people will have heard queer and then gotten beaten up. That's a very real thing, and usually that's people at this point who are probably about 45 to 50 and older really don't like this term, and this is a younger term, but it's also came up during like third wave feminism being used, like queercore. So in the 90s, like people that grew up in the 90s, that was very, very popular. And then even in younger generations, queer is being used regularly. Gender nonconforming, that's also like, so when we're talking about gender nonconforming, women who have short hair and wear jeans and t-shirts, men who wear makeup and maybe even wear a kilt. I mean, gender nonconforming is gender is different to each society, each place that we go, it's different. Okay, so just to play it safe, honor the desired name, gender, and pronoun that the individual desires. So when you have a client, a customer, whatever you want, because I'm not sure where you all work, I would like to know that, or who you work with, but it's ask them, how would you like me to identify you as? What's your name? And if someone has told you their pronouns and told you their gender identity, you can't remember, just be like, I'm having a little trouble. Can you remind me what your pronouns are? Especially if they are different. Like my pronouns are Z here, and here's, and that is hard for a lot of people because it's not common, but it doesn't mean that they're made up genders because everything's made up, right? All right, so full circle. History has not always been a binary affair. Binary is still reinforced by capitalism society, and so we really need to understand kind of the larger societal goal. Everything that happens when we have policies that change, when we have even down to you're getting your coffee and someone saying, hello ma'am, how can I help you? Or hello sir, how can I help you? Some of these gender things are really reinforced. One of the best ways that we can flag people that we are, LGBT inclusive is changing our forms. So instead of it saying gender, male, female, say sex, male, female, or other. Or we can say gender, man, woman, transgender, and other, because sometimes people need to write another thing, because transgender is kind of an umbrella type term. So changing your signage and actually changing how you greet people. If you have clients, asking them how they identify their gender for everyone. how they identify their gender and their sexuality. It's really important, and a lot of times we skip over those parts in our forms because it's uncomfortable to say what, how do you identify your your sexuality? What is your sexual life like? That is uncomfortable, but that's part of health. Sexual health is part of physical health. Civil and human rights, like, let's actually think, regardless of like if you agree with what I'm talking about or not, these are people. These are people that need to be treated. These are people that live in this world. And they just should be treated as people, and ask instead of assuming. All right, so I am open for questions.
And we do have a few questions. So
Awesome.
let's see. One is, as a social worker in a children's hospital that sees teens and young adults who identify as transgender, what is the one thing that I should say to them that will help them feel more comfortable with themselves? They come in for suicidality, anxiety, and depression. Many staff are wearing rainbow stickers on our badges to show we are safe people to talk to.
Yeah. I think that that's awesome that you have that flagging. I think that that's great that you have the rainbow stickers. However, even within the LGBT community, there's not a lot of understanding of transgender. So when we're talking about like gender stuff, there is a divide. There's a big divide between specifically gay men and lesbian women being in their own societies and not understanding the transgender part of it, and not believing that trans is a thing, and a whole, like, when we're talking about LGBT community, it's kind of like, oh, we lump everybody together. Anyway, I think it's really cool you guys wear the rainbow stickers. I think that's great. Probably just encouraging them, being like, you know what, I'm here to back you, however you feel like you need to identify, that's okay. And it's okay to explore, because a lot of young people, they'll have like 4 or 5 names. I know that when I was younger, I had several names before I even identified in the transgender umbrella. Like, I had names, like something wasn't quite right with my name that I was given by my parents. So I identified with a lot of names, but I've worked with a lot of middle school kids, and like each time I'm going, they're like, they have a different gender identity, they have a different name they're going by. One I know was named Boyd, and I'm like, okay, that's how you want to identify. That's totally cool. Like, I can appreciate that. If I click on this Q&A, I can actually see the questions. Emma?
Yes, you can. We also have some questions in the chat panel.
Oh, okay, so chat panel. I don't know how to get that part out.
If you want, I can read them out.
Sure, that would be good. Yeah, I'm not seeing the chat panel right now.
Yeah, let's see. So the next one was, could you speak to why it is important and when it is problematic to have gender dysphoria as a DSM diagnosis?
So whenever we have anything in the DSM, and even as a social worker and as a practicing therapist, I have personal conflict with the DSM, because many times we are stamping somebody with a label that may not fit for their whole life. Specifically, gender dysphoria. There's been a lot of movement, especially by younger people, where, to be trans, you need to have gender dysphoria, and a lot of people feel like you don't. Gender dysphoria just means that you have a disconnect from your gender, that kind of people are treating you what you've been assigned. And I don't see it as necessarily a bad thing, but I think that it is problematic that it's in the DSM. Because I don't think that it's necessarily a problem with the individual, but I think it's a societal problem. We cannot label society with a DSM label. So society sucks, DSM label, right? We have to take the individual who's not fitting into our narrow scope of what society is supposed to be, how you're supposed to be in society. We actually have to single it out. So part of that is like it's making that person, that child, that person, like some people really, really like it and they're like, oh yay, finally I have like a name for what's going on with me. And other people are like, it is making me have like a label that I don't want to have. It's, you know, making me part of like this medicalized institution that is a problem and comes from very problematic places, because essentially like our scientific method has come from trying to prove that certain people are better than other people and certain genders are better than other genders historically. And so when we're building everything on top of that kind of rickety house, when we look at like that's what we build everything, all of our science on, it becomes very, very problematic. And then these labels are also brought on or come up by a majority of white cisgender, so non-transgender, white cisgender straight men, and usually wealthy and learned. And so when you have a very narrow population coming up with labels for everyone else that does not fit into that box, then it becomes that, oh, there's nothing wrong with this box here, the people that are coming up with it, but there's a problem with everybody else. So it is a systematic issue. Systems theory, anybody?
Thank you. And then we had in LGBTQIA, what does the I stand for?
Intersex.
Thank you.
And I throw in the intersex not because I believe it's part of sexuality, as transgender is not a part of sexuality, that's gender, but intersex has been underrepresented. And your intersex and transgender are two different things. Just as someone who's intersex can also be gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, they can also be transgender. Trans people can be gay, lesbian, bisexual, blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
Thank you. And another question was, here is a new pronoun to me. What is the history behind that?
Here? Oh, here, this was, so some people are using Zzier. Here is a cross between his or hers, so here.
Perfect, thank you. And I believe you kind of answered this question earlier, but just for clarification, so when asking about sex, is there a basic, more acceptable way to ask when filling out an intake form, since most legal documents or forms do use the term gender?
I think that forms have gotten away from using the term sex because then it's, people don't like the term sex, even though they do like sex, but they don't want to see it when it comes to male and female. I guess changing your documentation, as much as people want to be like, it's so hard. I'm like, usually it's a couple of clicks. And it is like a different thing, but you're going to get more accurate data because essentially when you are collecting the data, so I'm going to go into a whole spiel about this. When you're collecting data though, if you have inaccurately labeled things, you're going to collect inaccurate data. If you're doing it because you need to label someone, do we really need to label them? Like, is it a medical issue? Like, do we need to know? Like, because sometimes like people that can check an F do not have a uterus and ovaries. And sometimes they don't even have a vagina. So like when we're asking that, what are we asking? You know? So I guess like it kind of comes to, I don't really know how to like make the world change, but it is like one institution at a time. And if we want to actually gather accurate data, we need to be using gender and gender terms. We need to be using sex and sex terms.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then we had, what is the best way to support a youth whom is transgender, but they really focus on their feeling of being, quote, dysphoric all the time?
Okay. Well, this is because I work with a lot of the young people, and I have quite a few clients of mine that are trans, and when they talk about being dysphoric, I think that sometimes they hook on to that word because they like it. It sounds good, it feels good in their mouth, whatever. But when we're looking at like the full picture of what a transgender person is, we're kind of like a pie, right? It's like we are like this little slice of we're an artist, and we're a scientist, and we have parents that are living, and we have siblings. What makes us a full person sometimes get overshadowed by over focusing on the gender stuff. So when we're hyper focusing on that, everything else gets blacked out. We're not like a three-dimensional person. Trans people go through this because they're trying to figure stuff out. If we're looking at the negative of dysphoric, and I'm wondering if you can clarify, is that because of their body, like they want to change their body, or are they just like using the term dysphoric? That's kind of like, are they wanting to get surgeries, hormones? Like, is that their main goal?
Thank you. And that was a question that was emailed in previously. So
Okay.
if they do some follow-up on the chat, I will let you know.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
the next question was, how would you suggest we start the conversation with a community that is more binary and less progressive?
I think that talking about being accepting and open and knowing that these people are going to come in, and I'm saying these people, trans people, these people. Gosh, I can't believe I said that. That's terrible. When you're gonna have all types of people come in, and you're gonna have all types of people that are identifying different ways. If you want to have less problems, it is better to educate yourselves. Having a conversation within, but also actually reaching out. There are a lot of trans educators in the California, just in general. And I want to make sure that my information, like you can always email me about any questions that you have, or if you need me to talk with people, I'm definitely open for that. But having a discussion of like, we have clients that are coming in that are identifying as transgender, that are pregnant men, that are women who need a prostate exam. You are going to come across this, and whether or not it's happened yet, it's just a matter of time. But it's better to be prepared rather than like having to scramble at the last minute and be like, oh crap, because we are having more and more young people identify as trans, and being able to get physical transition for a lot of people is becoming reality, where it was $1,500 to get surgeries, and black market hormones. So being able to be prepared and it's like more important, so you don't kind of look like idiots. Yeah. It would have been really nice. I went to for instance, a boyfriend of mine, was having kidney stones, but he wasn't really sure what was going on. He was a trans man, and he, for all intents and purposes, really looked like a cisgender man. We went to the hospital, they did an x-ray, and then we kept seeing people like pop their head in. This is in LA. Kept seeing people pop their head in the curtain in the ER. Kept popping their head, and nobody had come talk to us. And finally, someone came and said, "Did you know that you had female reproductive organs?" And he's like, "Yeah, I'm a trans man, and I put that on my papers." like he had answered those questions, but no one had bothered to read his paperwork. And then they were all, acting like it was a sideshow. It was kind of awful. And I hope that they were embarrassed because it was very demeaning. But this isn't like an isolated incident. This happens frequently. I have a good friend and his husband. They had a baby. One of the men carried the child, and that was all kinds of headache for them. But this was their child, and so they had worked with a doctor and had brought the doctor in. The hospital was better because they had worked with them, but there still were people that yeah. Oh, you're welcome about the nature loves varieties. Yeah, but anyway, I hope I've answered the question, but it's one of those things where it's just better to be prepared rather than embarrass yourself and like make someone feel like not wanted.
Thank you. And I just wanted to remind everyone, you can either do the Q&A box or the chat box to ask any questions. So then our next one, which you kind of talked about previously, was, do you recommend offices have the safe space stickers or something different than that? Or if so, what should those look like and where should they be put?
Okay, safe space stickers are great if people are regularly trained on how to make a safe space. You can get those stickers, but if you have one person on your staff that puts their bias out there, or that is not does not offer what safe space is supposed to be, then it makes those stickers null and void. And getting one training at one time, getting stickers for you to put up is really not enough. Like, this needs to be a yearly training. This should be just right along with all the other HR trainings as far as I'm concerned. But I know that there are some places are starting to put transgender training under like sexual harassment training, but it's like a little blip on the radar and it's kind of in a weird place. But safe space, that's great, but prove it. Kind of like, and to go into this, where a lot of people like to say, well, I'm an ally. We cannot claim to be an ally. You cannot label yourself and stamp yourself an ally. Ally is not, it's not a noun, it's a verb. It's an action word. You have to prove your allyship. Messing up is okay. Messing up is totally okay, but always trying to further. And when somebody calls you on something, say, I'm so sorry, I was wrong, and then go on with your life. Like, go on with your stuff and say, I'll do better next time, and do better next time. Because we're all learning, right? We're all learning. But yeah, I see safe space stickers and I get treated really crappy at the front desk because of the way that I look. And I get that regularly because I have a mustache and like my voice is a little bit higher and people aren't sure what's going on, and I get ma'am sir ma'am a lot, which is totally okay. But like, even places that say safe space, I don't necessarily believe it because I've had poor treatment in those areas. And that means, and when we're doing safe space stickers, even when we have reception people, they also need to be trained on this stuff. I know that they're not doing direct service, but they kind of are, because they're the first people that people meet. And if someone looks at me like and then wants me to like fill out a form, I am like, I want to walk away, and that's just my personal experience as a trans person. And I'm pretty confident in myself and who I am. But if you're coming up on someone who is newly trying to figure out who they are, and they get that kind of treatment, that's scary. That's a turnoff. It makes you want to go back in the closet or back where you came from. So yeah, safe space, cool. Just definitely keep that training going. And I would say, I really want to encourage any organizations to hire people for training. Please hire trans people to do your training. Don't be trained by someone who's not trans to do a trans training. It's very, very important that you actually employ trans people and prove that it's worth you to learn about these things. And so sometimes bringing that in is, sometimes you have the budget for the diversity, so please use it.
And we had a question in the Q&A that I think was a follow-up. So it was, and unfortunately, the reality is that in order for insurance to cover therapy, surgeries, and hormones, they require diagnosis bases for treatment.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I just saw that and I'm like, blah, gross. Yes. And again, I have an argument with the DSM, but I also have a lot of Medicaid clients, like most of my clients are Medicaid. Yes, I have to put something on there. Many times you just need to get an initial diagnosis on there. So it can be for depression. I would be very open and honest with someone who you're treating, what their diagnosis is. So if you are going to put gender dysphoria on, talk to them and tell them what that's about. Get out the DSM and read that with them and say, does this sound like you? In order for us to get services, I need to put this down. Is this okay? Getting consent about a diagnosis, I think, especially for those types of things, is very, very important. Not that long ago, we had being gay, being homosexual was in the DSM. Not that long ago, and trans is still in there. So considering that, looking at that, I know that we need diagnosis for certain things, but I would be, most trans people who are seeking surgeries and things, they have done a lot of research, and know what they're supposed to say and know how they're supposed to say it. And unfortunately, that's kind of a reality for trans people. Like, I know a lot of trans people that don't identify as binary, but they know that they need to go to the doctor and say, well, I want to be a man or I want to be a woman, so they can get the correct hormones, even though they don't identify as that, because they feel like they need hormones for their transition. Transition isn't the same for everyone, but kind of like going through a bigger thing. But yes, for treatment, you need a diagnosis. And there are certain things that we put on paperwork that we don't necessarily like. It's not a big thing, but yes, for treatment. And I'm not really sure with medical treatment with trans people. Yeah, but therapy specifically can be covered. You don't necessarily have to have a gender dysphoria for therapy, because there's other things that happen with trans people and with queer people in general, where we have anxiety, depression, PTSD is super common. Trauma is like almost 100% of trans people have some sort of trauma just from like day-to-day life. PTSD is super, super common. So when you're having certain trans people with psychosis, really look into, is it PTSD? Before you start looking at other things. Doesn't mean that other things don't happen, but when you're having to do survival sex, when you're trying to figure out where you're going to live, when you're trying to not get, harassed on a daily basis or be called ma'am over and over, or sir over and over, with how you identify, there's going to be some mental health stuff that happens. And I would highly recommend, if you are going to treat people with trans stuff, do a lot of your own research. The best research that I found, and I know this sounds a little counterintuitive, however, YouTube, where people are talking about their own trans experience, is one of the best places to get information. Most trans people kind of all know each other, kind of quote, we all know each other because we talk about our doctors with each other, because we have networks with each other, because we know what hospitals not to go to and which ones to go to. And so just going on YouTube and watching some videos of people and of different gender identities can actually give a lot of insight in what people might be thinking. But again, they're speaking from their own experience. I'm speaking from my own experience. But I have worked with a lot of trans people too, and in mental health. Anything else?
Thank you. We don't have any more questions. I'll just put it out there again. If anyone has any last minute questions, we do still have a few minutes left. If you want to type those either in the Q&A or in the chat section.
Yeah.
I'll give it a minute.
I am going to bring something up that I didn't talk about in this display. We are kind of getting into medicalization of transgender bodies. So people that are getting surgeries, getting hormones, getting contouring. There's a lot, and when we're talking about trans surgeries, it's not just one surgery. What one person gets is not necessarily, when we're talking about the surgery, like a bottom surgery, that usually what they're talking about, the surgery, those are not easy to heal from. It's usually multiple surgeries, and there's a lot of different varieties of surgery. Please, I implore you, if you have trans clients, do not push upon them, okay, well, when are you going to get hormones? When are you going to get surgeries? Ask them, are you wanting hormones? Are you wanting surgeries? There's a lot of young people that are starting to explore their gender and being allowed to explore their gender, but they're still being funneled into, okay, you need to either identify as a boy or a girl. We don't know a lot about hormone blockers. We don't know a lot about, you know, what happens when we use hormone blockers, what happens when we start kids early on hormones. And we really don't have a lot of research on long-term effects of hormones on bodies, just in general. We don't have a lot. Just like we don't have a lot of information on women's bodies, because women's sexual health care was only really started being examined in the 70s, 1970. So, you know, we don't even have a lot of information about bodies that aren't male and people that identify as man and male.
Great. Well, I think that's it for the questions. I haven't gotten any new ones. So I want to say thank you so much, Orion, for being on here with us today and for sharing this information. And
so I just wanted to thank everybody so much for allowing me to speak and allowing your minds to be expanded and exploring this.
thank you.